Hey, welcome to the show. Nice to have you on again, mate.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
Where are you this week, Craig?
I'm in Auckland this week. I've had a series of meetings with businesses that have to report their June financial year results. So it's an intense time for directors to get those out to the market so investors can see how their companies have been doing. So, yeah, Auckland this week.
So how many companies are you a director of that are listed on the New Zealand Stock Exchange?
Well, the two that are listed Precinct Properties, which we've spoken about before, and the second one is NZ Wind Farms, which we've also spoken about. The third business is the Local Government Funding Agency, which is not listed, but its debt is listed on the NZDX. So we have approximately $18 billion worth of debt that we've raised in global capital markets, and that's listed on the exchange, and it's traded. The debt's traded and is available for retail investors who do buy our bonds.
Sorry, so just to explain, the Local Government Funding Agency provides money to local government, from anywhere from the Auckland City Council, I guess, to the Waimate District Council, for what, largely infrastructural projects, aren't they?
CapEx, yeah, capital expenditure. So we have 78 councils in New Zealand, 77 of them are members of the LGFA voluntarily. We have 31 shareholders, one of whom is the Crown, at around 20%, and the balance owned by councils. So we're a CCO, a council-controlled organisation that started from scratch in 2011 and now is a AAA-rated issuer of bonds to domestic and international investors, and we raise that money, pass through our organisation to pay for expenses and then pass that on to borrowers and the council borrowers, and they use that for their capital expenditure. Just like your council, Central Otago District Council, they're a member, and that council, or the regional council, sorry, borrows from us.
And the theory being that if all the councils are borrowing from one agency, i.e. you, they will get their funding or their borrowing cheaper than if they were head off to the BNZ or the ANZ or the ASB or whatever.
That's correct. So there are sort of three primary reasons to use us. One is the cost of funds, which you've identified. Secondly, we're open 24/7, so we're always available to help councils with their borrowing needs. And thirdly, we provide term debt. Currently our longest maturity is 2037. So we can provide longer term funding than what would typically be available from financial intermediaries like banks.
You're guaranteed by the government, Craig?
No, we're not.
Oh, so if the whole thing goes down and you would find some sort of catastrophe, that's visited upon your shareholders? That's, well, technically true, but in fact the way the structure works is investors who purchase our bonds have the benefit of AAA credit rating. We have very strong security by way of our lending protocols to councils. Like any lender to councils, ultimately it's secured by ratepayers. So just like they've done when the councils borrowed before LGFA was around, same protocols are in place. So it's almost impossible for you to get a default on a loan, is it? Because A, you've got the government sitting there at 20% who's got access to the taxpayer, and because the people who borrow from you have got access to the ratepayer.
Well, you look at the history of councils and managing their finances, and it's very hard to identify, with perhaps some debate over whether a council got into trouble in the 1930s or thereabouts. It's very hard to find evidence of councils ever defaulting. It's normally a case of if there's concerns, as has been the case in some councils, commissioners are put in to rectify what might be log-jammed council issues, and the commissioners work on the balance sheet and the funding and financing of the council activities, and at some point those commissioners move on, new councils put in place and on go.
Now, Craig, you're used to dealing in this area. Most of us aren't. What's the total amount of money that you've borrowed, that has been borrowed through the local government funding agency and then lent out again to
councils throughout New Zealand? What total budget are we talking here?
We've got around $18 billion of bonds on issue, and we on-lend a substantial proportion of that, some of which we keep behind for our own liquidity purposes, which is prudent, but basically we on-lend most of that. And it's driven by council demand. We are simply a lender to the sector. We don't prescribe activities that councils want to undertake for the capital expenditure. That's up to councils themselves, but we are available to assist them when they need the funds.
So the story is, and I mean Three Waters and all those sorts of local government reforms, there's been a local government review just run recently, I'm sure you've seen as well. The government's, or whatever the new government is going to be, has got to respond formally to that. You expect further demand? Because at the moment it would seem that New Zealand councils are being told that they've underinvested, particularly in infrastructure, in addition to which, as climate change raises its ugly head, there are a whole series of future-proofing that hasn't been planned for or funded. Are you expecting, obviously, your funding agency to grow quite significantly to meet those demands, yeah?
Well, there's a question of the policies that will be in place post the election. So, as you'll appreciate, there's quite divergent views amongst the main political parties around the efficacy of the reforms. So we're looking at the political debate on these issues. Underlying that, council's put in place, as you know, 10-year long-term plans, and most of them are working off the status quo because in the absence of reforms going through and the government the new government confirming them, they're working off the status quo. So you can see scenarios developing where the status quo continues, or there's a shift of water assets and associated obligations to the new 10 affordable water entities. And on top of that, you have your normal concerns that are around today, regardless of reforms, and that is climate and what that may mean around replacing infrastructure that's destroyed by climate. It's around how they might like to make the infrastructure more robust in a preventative sense. And the third sort of thing is a view that's come out of the Office of the Auditor General around councils fully funding the depreciation of their assets. What I mean by that is that assets grow old and crumble, and at some point they have to be replaced. And so good councils should be thinking about how they're going to fund that infrastructure today so that the replacement of that infrastructure is not borne by future generations, but the cost of that is shared by ratepayers today. So the Office of the Auditor General argued that in many cases councils are underfunding their depreciation, which pushes the onus on the cost of replacement to future generations, which I think is a really important discussion point for ratepayers and councils, that actually rates are arguably not enough to fund depreciation today.
This is a really good conversation to be having just at the moment, because rates are very high in New Zealand at the moment already. I've got climate change and climate resilience, obviously as Cyclone Gabriel has exemplified. This is a great discussion to be having. Just before we go into that, let's just get this fully funding depreciation of assets stuff underway. Now, let's just say I've made my sewage network and, you use Wanganui, there's a good example. I've got my sewage network in Wanganui. It's a whole reticulation of taking stuff from my toilet out to the treatment station and then from the treatment station wherever it's going. So I've got a sewage reticulation system, Craig. And I've loan funded that because that's already intergenerational. So I've made sure it's not all funded, not all the ratepayers who are paying now are going to do that. I've borrowed money from you, the local government funding agency, to make that happen. I might have identified that it's going to be 50 years, that loan, and it'll be paid back off that so that you do get the intergenerational equity that you're talking about. But here's the issue. Year one, I'm meant to depreciate that asset because that asset may last 50 years, let's just say, just for argument's sake. It's going to last 50 years until I am going to have to replace it in toto or in part. Do I actually rate that money of the asset?
Well, you've borrowed a loan, you borrowed against it, haven't you? So
I have.
Effectively,
yes.
Yeah, effectively you're trying to smooth the costs of that future replacement by asking ratepayers to pay interest today through the life of that loan.
Yeah. But what about the depreciation costs? So in 50 years' time, I'm going to need to replace this asset. That's the theory. It never quite works that way, but that's the theory. And I'm depreciating that asset over the next 50 years too, aren't I?
Yes, you're depreciating that, so you're going to need to think about repairs and maintenance on the way through.
That's
so
right.
OPEX required to look after it.
Yep.
And then at some stage you're going to have to replace it. So how do you do that? You need to think about how you're managing your cash flows to replace that. The issue is the impost on a future generation of that replacement if it's not gradually replaced through time.
But here's the I used to argue this when I was mayor. Pardon me. But in 50 years' time, because it is never stuff. You never quite know how long these assets are going to last for. I've got to replace the asset. Why don't I just go and get another loan and put it over 50 years again? Why am I needing to depreciate my asset when eventually, when I do need to replace it, I'll simply take out another loan for however long the life of the asset, and everybody will be paying intergenerationally anyhow?
Yeah, well, that's a choice you can make. There's no sort of science in this. The question that the OAG is asking is, are councils funding enough of that depreciation? So it's obviously going on, but are they funding enough? Are they covering that enough today? And the answer in the OAG reports is no.
All right, but every council, every one of the 78 councils you've mentioned at the start of our conversation, Craig, presumably will have a different take on that, will they?
Yes, they do. It's not uniform at all. It's varied. Some councils have relatively new infrastructure that have been put in place recently by way of disasters like Christchurch. So it's a different time frame because of the newness of the assets. Others need to do a lot more work on building up cash to be able to pay for those replacements at some point.
I've just had a question here. Is it true that councils put up citizens' land as a security against the loan? Therefore, we could lose our land if the council defaults, Jones?
No. It's a very traditional structure where ratepayers are obligated to pay rates to councils. That's very clear in legislation. And the issue is normally what happens when ratepayers don't pay their rates. That's a discussion between councillors and the ratepayers, but they're obligated to pay their rates.
Yeah, so they'll just simply they'll add to your rates rather than take your land. There's 10 new water entities. I think the legislation went through Parliament, Craig, yesterday, was it? I think finally.
Yes, last 3 hours, that's right.
Yeah, so there's 10 new water entities have been set up or established. There were 4, there are now 10, to develop or deliver the 3 water services and infrastructure, I guess, as well. There's a delay of 2 years. Those water entities, are they going to be borrowing through your agency or are they going somewhere else?
The legislation provides for an entity to provide that. It's unclear at this stage how that entity will operate, for example. So I can't give an answer at this stage. I simply don't know.
But you'd know if you're on the local government agency if they're going through you, yeah?
Yes, that's true, but at the moment our shareholders and borrowers and the way we operate is set up to provide funding to councils.
Well, that's the next question I was going to ask. So let's just take Whanganui again as a really good example. I would have assumed that they've come to the local government agency, of which you are Director, Craig, and they will have borrowed money for their water infrastructure. These new water entities have been now established, and they are meant to be transferring all of those assets plus the debt that's owed to you, to these new water entities. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, that debt has to be repaid by the councils.
So the issue is the transition issues you can imagine between the water services entities and the councils. So that's that transition piece that's not clear.
Right. So you're not clear about it either, because I'm sitting here and thinking this is a, word of the year, boondoggle. It just looks odd to me. I guess that's one of the reasons why they're going to take 2 years to try and work it out, are they?
Yes, there are lots of issues to work through still, clearly. So we've got legislation in terms of forming the 10 entities, and discussions are ongoing between councils and the Crown around the transition from, call it today, post-legislation to a start date. So bear in mind that things have moved from 4 entities to 10. So how those entities look, are they equivalent? Are they different? What's the transition to get to 2024 or 2026? So you can imagine the detail is really important, and that's what government needs to be working on now.
Yes, forgive me for saying, but you'd expect that they would have worked that out before they passed the legislation, but obviously not.
Well, I think you've seen divergence of views of councils on the efficacy of the reforms. Some councils don't have debt associated with water per se. Others do. You've got Te Arawai, the regulator, looking at making sure that the water quality is of a certain standard. What are the costs under the current framework to get up to speed? So, there's quite a lot of uncertainty around exactly what the details will look like. So, it's not clear to us. It's not clear to the public. So we're waiting for more information to come out from the Crown.
Having said that, there's an election in 8 weeks' time, and to add to that uncertainty, it appears that the people who have framed the legislation and put it through Parliament may not be there in 8 weeks, and people who have dedicated themselves to the repeal and replacement of that legislation will be. From a director's point of view, Craig, as a business leader, both in the private and in the public, well, the sort of quasi-public sector, are you sitting there going, I'm not going to do anything for 8 weeks?
No, we don't do that. We plan on alternatives. So what is status quo? If the reforms go through, what if a new government waives the reforms completely and moves to proposed CCO structures? So what does that mean for us? So we just continually run options around what it all means for our shareholders and our members, bearing in mind that we're not policy people. We are effectively a financial intermediary who provides funding. So we will assist the sector wherever we can. Our purpose is to benefit local communities through efficient financing. That's what we do. So if we can help in any way, we will, subject to all the covenants and foundation policies that our shareholders require us to adhere to. So we are here to help. It's a question of what is the form of that help post the election.
Listen, and the other thing, you might have some talking points of your own, but can I just ask very quickly, because of your expert background, you've been involved in government taxation reviews yourself. I think you chaired one. It was called the Stobo Report, from memory, for a wee while there, Craig. You had it named after you. I've seen one mentioned in the media that Michael Cullen formed on, I think it was removing, or in part, dealing with the issue of removing GST from food. And were you involved in that one?
There was a working group in 2019, and you might recall I spoke briefly about that last week, and in their recommendations, number 86 or 87, I can't remember now, but it advocated retention of existing GST, not to carve out food, on the basis that tax is a pretty poor way of redistribution. It adds complexity to taxation. And we went through issues last week around what is a fresh vegetable and what would the Minister of Food and Vegetables, how would they stand up an expert group to opine on boundaries? You get in a very messy area. Is the bag that has got the veggies in it part of the ex-GST package, or is it taxed differently? It gets really complicated.
Yes, it does. But
that was a working group that was stood up by Michael Cullen in 2019, and he was appointed by the current government to do that.
And he looked at it, and one of the key findings was he made that roughly only about a quarter of the pass would actually of the taking off the GST would actually be passed through the consumer, but through that food chain and through the supermarket chain, those other savings would be absorbed by those entities. Did I get that right?
Yes. So the question would be, if I'm a retailer of fresh fruit and veg, and the reduction is 15%, the GST is removed, would that full price reduction move through the consumer? It's doubtful in my mind that would be the case. And in any event, food prices are moving around all the time. So very quickly you lose track of comparing broccoli with broccoli, don't you? Because broccoli today at, call it $2.49 a head versus broccoli in 1 year's time adjusted for GST, you've got no idea of whether you've captured that GST rebate for yourself, because the price of the underlying vegetables changed.
Yeah, that's right. And on that issue, sorry, I went to a council meeting yesterday, so I think it was on Tuesday night. Is it Tuesday night or Monday night that the TV1 Varian poll came out and was released? It's showing that National had gone up 2 to 37%, Labour had dropped 4 points, under 30 to 29, ACT up 1 to 13, Greens up 2 to 12, New Zealand First hovering just under the threshold. From a business commercial point of view, when you see those polls and you are planning, you're running, I assume, and you just talked about running a series of alternatives. Does that make your job harder or easier in dealing with the uncertainty of a potential change of government, or does it make it easier for you in terms of we know where these guys are coming from?
Well, I think transparency is great. Businesses generally have relatively long time horizons. It's not they're not organisations that are hand to mouth. Well, hopefully they're not. They generally have business plans for 12 months and the longer strategic plans further out around how the environment could evolve by influencing it ourselves, of course, or by dint of world changes in global markets, for example. So, no, we will be hoping that whichever colour comes into Parliament, that what they say today will be what they roll out, so that we can work with them to work with them, work under them, work to them to put in place our business plans to suit that environment. The worst thing is change, unexpected change that comes from a political decision that's not driven by an economic or a global trend that we might see relatively easily. But political changes are really hard to accommodate. So the best thing for business is stability. So you think about the purpose of business, which is to profitably solve society's problems. Being aware of those problems and working on that is what I believe business does extremely well. What is hard is when the political environment changes and you think you're working in one paddock and you find you have to jump to another. And with all the changes that requires to capital plans and customer support issues. So political uncertainty is just dreadful for business.
There is a democratic process every 3 years. You just have to factor that into your equation, don't you?
Yes, that's why you can demonstrate transparency of policies beforehand to the electorate. Say, this is what we propose. If you vote for us, we have a mandate to roll those out. We'll do it. And then just get on and do it. Great, we understand that. That's what the people have chosen. Fantastic. and we know what you're going to do. Okay, we can work with that.
Yeah. And is there anything that, very quickly, we've got a minute to go, that we've missed over the last week that you think should be brought to our attention?
I was just going to go through some immigration numbers.
Oh, yes.
Michael.
Yes.
Just very briefly. So net year to June, 87,000 net inward migration. Within that, there's some interesting numbers around the net outward migration of Kiwis, so 35,000 over that period of time left New Zealand net, and the balance inward coming in to balance that. The categories of nationalities is led by the Indian population, followed by Filipinos and Chinese. So those three groups comprise the largest ethnicities coming to New Zealand. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about what that means for all sorts of reasons. And the last one was just to go through the difficulties that employers have when working through different wage rates to employ people through the accredited work visa scheme, where the wage setting for that, which starts 1 September, I think is $29.66 an hour. If I employ someone in the employer scheme that enables us to employ people in our orchards, there's not 19,000 of those as of April helping us in horticulture and viticulture. They're required to pay the living wage at $26. And of course, we have everybody else in New Zealand working off a minimum wage of $22.70. It's really hard for employers to have centralised wage setting like that when you have regional variations for a start. Plus, if I'm employing someone, I might offer a whole lot of benefits such as cars, training, tools, accommodation, that reflects value to the employee, but government's telling us we have to pay these wages. It's unrelated to the benefits that they may get. So it's one of those peculiar outcomes of wage setting from centralised bureaucrats that makes it really difficult for employers, and that just needs to change.
Thank you, Craig. It's always a pleasure talking to you. We'll talk more, I think, about immigration next week when we have a chat to you. Have a good rest of the week, mate.
Thanks, Michael. Take care.
Bye now. Bye-bye. Is Craig Stobo. Listen, always gives you a fascinating perspective of what the commercial community are thinking. And yeah, we're very, 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 very lucky to have that kind of insight. The interesting thing also is that he's not scared of speaking. He's not scared of speaking his mind. Rob Campbell sacked as the chairman of Te Whatu Ora, government organisation, obviously. Jason Aki had to resign from the Radio New Zealand board for expressing a freedom of speech issue as well, whether you disagree or agree with him. Craig Stobo, fearless, good man.